Welcome our guests for the masterclass today, Ms. Ulka, and we have Ms. Aarti from Climate Trends, Ms. Sonali and Shreeshan from Climate Trends. Welcome you all to this masterclass. And I also welcome all the Climate Asia ambassadors who have joined us today for this masterclass, along with all the other team members from Climate Asia and Ratan. So the agenda for today is basically uh, two master classes from two eminent speakers we have invited. And we have in this room all our Climate Asia ambassadors. I'll give a brief context around what this program is about and what are the objectives and why are we doing this master class. And then we will start with the program. Um, so, as you all know, I mean, I think everyone in this room is interested in climate action, and the whole world has acknowledged the need for working towards climate action, towards either mitigating or adapting or being resilient to climate change. And Climate Asia is taking up the initiative to sort of understand the talent needs of the climate action space, and at the same time also helping organizations to find the right kind of talent that can work with them to achieve the goals, the climate goals that every organization has uh, started having these goals. And I think we have seen a lot of climate negotiations happening over the last decade, and this decade is all about action, and that's what we are seeing in many different quarters. And especially in India, we see a lot of demand and surge in the climate jobs or the green jobs. And at Climate Asia, we are constantly trying to understand what this climate jobs landscape looks like and what kind of talent are ready to enter into climate action space. And we're also constantly tracking the talent that is available who are ready to transition into a climate career. So with all this, we have started off with this program, which we are calling as Climate Asia Ambassadors. So where we give opportunity to young professionals, working professionals, to explore climate career. Uh, Half of the Climate Asia ambassadors come with some sort of an experience in the climate action space, while half of them come with totally no experience of working in the climate action space. So it's a good mix of people who are looking for climate jobs without having knowledge of the ecosystem, which is what we are trying to provide through this program. And the interactions like this today through the master class is where we invite prominent people who have worked in the climate action space, who understand the space, to come and talk to the professionals in the cohort. And this Climate Asia Ambassadors Program is sort of a pilot inaugural cohort designed together by Climate Asia and with help from Climate Trends as the knowledge partner. So we look forward to see more and more such master classes and more such interactions with young professionals through this program. In this program today for the masterclass, we will first have opening remarks from Ms. Aarti from Climate Trends, followed by the masterclasses from both Ms. Ulka and then Mr. Shreeshan from Climate Trends. And I'll do a brief introduction of our speakers. And before that, I request everyone to, if possible, if your internet bandwidth allows, for the video also to be open, please keep the video on and you can keep your mic on the mute. And for especially the ambassadors of the cohort, if you have any questions that you have prepared to ask the speakers today, so please feel free to put it in the chat box or keep it ready for the Q&A session later. So with that, I welcome our speakers, and first I will introduce our first speaker, Ms. Aarti Khosla, who's the founder and director of Climate Trends. And Climate Trends is a strategic communications initiative working at the intersection of development and climate change with an aim to build a public understanding of environmental issues. Aarti is also the director of Carbon Copy, which offers the latest news and updates on climate and energy issues from India. And she comes with 20 years of experience working on small and large campaigns, various communication efforts across the environmental sector, FMCG sector, and media. So, welcome, Aarti. Glad to have you as our first speaker, and over to you for the opening remarks.
Thanks very much, Kaushik, for a very warm introduction. At the end of it all, 2 decades of experience to a cohort which is so young and energetic feels really like, a different place to start, but very pleased to be here and very, very pleased to be interacting with all the climate ambassadors of Arthan. I wanted to take less time, but talk a little bit about why we have structured this conversation. Climate Trends is an organization which was established mostly with the premise of making climate discussions more relatable to a policy audience as well as to a public audience. The reason why we chose to do this simply was because in our understanding, the way climate action is emerging as a very sharp issue, it's making several interconnections. Traditionally, about 10, 15 years back, climate was mostly considered a scientific concept. The intersections were mostly with how much finance is needed, what kind of technology is needed, what kind of foreign policy issues exist. And even then, it was pretty complicated. Now, and especially in this year, as you will have seen, as the world has gone through rolling and interconnected crises, there is conversations of how Europe buying gas is fueling not just climate change, but it's also fueling Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The way the gas prices have increased in the spot markets and in other places, the food prices have increased as a result of that. And Asian countries are paying a lot more for food as a result of this than they were paying last year. There are far more interconnections today, not just about geopolitics, solutions, problems, science, technology, macroeconomic issues, but also interrelated as we've emerged out of the implications of COVID. Climate Trends was established in 2017, and the idea really is to not just reach out to decision makers to be able to fit what they are trying to do faster and link it to what the possible solutions are, but to also reach out to more audience, more cohorts, more groups of informed colleagues who are not working on climate change directly, so to speak, but are in a position to embed climate knowledge, climate information, and climate awareness in any and all kinds of development policy. And it's pretty clear, whether you're talking about health or air quality, or we are talking about coal mining and jobs, or we are talking about Delhi traffic management, air quality concerns. In the end, eventually, a lot of it is indeed boiling down to how much you can fast track climate action and get gains, not just on the climate front, but also on the development front. This is pretty much the purpose of this workshop as well. Our intention is that rather than speaking to the choir and speaking to the converts, we wanted to widen our reach a little bit more, speak to you all as young professionals who are evaluating what you would like to do, and perhaps offer to you the approach where we come from, which is mostly, whether your interest is in analysis or in strategy or in research or in media or in policy. We really feel that there is a contribution that has to be made and can be made by linking what you all are doing with what is needed for climate action and climate policies to be more center stage in India. I think this year, especially, the impacts have been quite stark. In March already, it was documented that the heat wave was the worst ever since weather records were kept. In the same year, India stopped the export of wheat, especially at a time where wheat exports had stopped from Russia and Ukraine. And nobody would imagine, indeed, that a climate situation, which essentially is more drastic heat wave than would have been predicted, has led to a situation of trade imbalance in wheat export from India. So I think the only point that I'm trying to make is that the connections are pretty much there. It's for all of us to see and not just visualize and imagine, but it just needs a slightly different approach than just climate scientists, policy decision makers, modelers, and international climate policy experts talking about it. The domestic imperative to act in India is far more than it was before. Even with monsoons, it's not just the floods in Pakistan. I think the cascade in that region has also been evident in Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. And you can see how the monsoons are so lopsided over there. And despite the fact that India overall has a quote unquote normal monsoon, there is stark difference between how rains have been torrential in Uttarakhand and Himachal, but at the same time have either been scarce or have been depleted in other parts of India, perhaps including central India as well. So how is it that these kind of connections can be brought forward more in the work that you all are doing today or will do in future? How is it that we can talk about climate not as a Western concept of faster action because emissions have to be reduced, but mostly as a concept of we need to act because our own vulnerabilities are very high, our own resilience is very low, and our own need to have a better quality of life, whether due to reducing air pollution or just due to reducing emissions, is far more imminent than before. I just wanted to have a freewheeling chat, which is why, no presentation, etc. at this moment. But that's also for our experts, Ulka and Shri, to share. I'll pause by only saying once again that thanks very much for joining us in evening and end of the day. This is the first of its kind. We would like to hear from you at the end of this, what your views are on this kind of an engagement and interaction. We would also like to share our views on how did we find this interaction from the point of view of somebody who is not eating, sleeping, drinking climate change, but is also interested in other matters and other views of the world. And I think definitely in the spirit of doing more of this, at least I can say that we would love to keep this interaction going, but right now is not the time to say that. Right now, I think it's the time to just pause. And I think, Kaushik, I will hand it back to you to go on with the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you, Aarti. I think we'll get started with the masterclass, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of time for interactions. And I think, like you said, Climate Asia ambassadors are all in their own ways working with us on various assignments, navigating through the ecosystem, knowing the ecosystem better, whether it is in terms of research, media and communications, or business development, partnerships, etc. So let's get into the next part of this session today. The next part of the session is a short masterclass by Ulka, and I'll do the introduction. So the topic of this masterclass is to introduce the climate change and its intersectionality with socio-economic issues that we are facing. And a brief introduction about our speaker. Ulka Kelkar is the director of the climate program at the World Resources Institute in India, and she is an economist with 2 decades of experience in climate change research, capacity building, and outreach. She's leading the WRA India's work on climate policy, which aims to support India's pathway to climate resilient, low carbon economy. Through various national policies, support carbon market mechanisms, and effective implementation. So before joining WRA India, Ulka worked as consultant for Asian Development Bank. She was a research fellow with TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute, and Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment. Ulka has also worked with corporate sector on measuring greenhouse gas emissions and developing CDM projects. Her contributions also include the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation Roadmap, the SARC Roadmap for Regional Cooperation on Climate Change. And she also has been part of First Communications of India and Bhutan to UNFCCC. Her research has been published in various journals, and Ulka holds a master's degree in economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Thank you for being here, Ulka. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and very nice to be with all of you today, this evening. I'm going to start sharing my screen. What I'm going to talk about is really what Aarti has already spoken about very succinctly, but I'm going to just take a little longer and and maybe use some pictures. I'll take a few minutes to, the brief that was given to me was to introduce climate change, and I hear from Kaushik that many of you are very familiar with climate change and have worked in this space, and for others it may be relatively new and you may be looking for closer connections with the work that you do. And then I was also asked to talk about how those connections are throughout society, economy, and all of that. So that's a pretty vast topic. Many things that I'm sure you would like to bring up in the discussions. So I only have about 26, 27 slides where I'll just touch upon a few things, and then we can keep aside 15, 20 minutes for discussion at some stage. So Aarti spoke about this heat wave that hit India this year, and according to the World Meteorological Organization, it was 30 times more likely only because of climate change. So we saw, on social media, a lot of maps like this. They can be a little misleading because they are not the air temperature. The air temperature was not 60 degrees Celsius. It's the land temperature. But we saw these very disturbing images which showed the extreme nature of the heat wave, but also how widespread it was, even for people like us who have grown up in a hot tropical country. It was something that was perhaps unusual, and particularly for those communities who are not able to protect themselves, whose jobs depend on going out in that heat, whether they are farmers or laborers or delivery persons. This is something that is a very disturbing kind of precursor, the sense that maybe there'll be worse in the next years to come. This has direct impacts on, as Aarti pointed out, on food security. One of the news headlines that came out in May was that wheat production was hit by this heat stress. And this is at a time when the Ukraine war meant that global wheat trade had been impacted, prices were high, and the food security that we have been very concerned about and have been working to protect was directly hit. Also on the energy side, there was a direct implication as well, because with the increased demand for cooling, and again, in the context of the various geopolitical situation, that is, Europe did not want to buy more and more gas from Russia. So there was this energy price volatility, which is continuing to the present day. And as a result of that, you can think of it as a kind of vicious cycle. That is, because of the heat that has increased and the demand for cooling energy that has increased, we need to, as a country, look at every possible source of energy that we have right now, even if some of this is fossil energy. So if we want to phase down the use of fossil energy that increases climate change, then we really have to accelerate the scaling up of renewable energy like solar and wind. So I'll be talking about these, but this slide was just to show that these are very unprecedented trends that we are beginning to see, and that they have connections with different sectors of the economy. So many of you would have seen these kinds of slides. This is from the latest IPCC report. And the interesting thing is that many people often still ask, is this really climate change? Is it really because of climate change? There's a lot of variation in nature. There is a lot of solar cycles. There are many, many other things in nature. But scientists have simulated that if you were to look at the natural factors, this green band is what our temperature would be. Yes, there would be variation year to year, but it wouldn't be this kind of temperature increase. The only way you can explain what we have seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years is if you were to bring in the impact of climate change. Now, I'm going to just pause and ask a question, and if anybody can unmute themselves and try to answer the question, I'll be very grateful. I can't see the chat box, but I want to ask one question. Over here in this natural variability graph, and over here as well in the observed, why is there a fall in the temperature? Quite a fall, right? Does anybody know which year is somewhere around the 90 mark? Why did this happen? I'll just wait in case someone can unmute and answer this question.
Was it because of the volcanic eruption?
Is it because of the what? Could you just repeat?
Volcanic eruption.
You're absolutely right. There was a major volcanic eruption in 1991, I think Mount Pinatubo, and that is what caused global cooling to happen. Yeah, so that is something that we have to keep in mind as well. There are many things going on, but the kind of relentless increase in temperature that we are seeing is not only in average terms, but also in terms of extreme events. So what this picture shows you, that think of a extremely hot day, like maybe a heat wave event. And it's not something that has never happened in history. Of course, these things happen, but they tend to happen at this extreme level, say once in 50 years, for example. So that's the normal or the usual frequency of this kind of event. And that's the normal climate that we have. 1850 to 1900 is like a baseline historical climate, where an extremely hot day happens once in 50 years. Now, already with a 1 degree Celsius warming that has already happened as a result of greenhouse gas emissions that we've been putting into the atmosphere, the frequency of this extremely hot day is now 5 times as likely. With 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what the Paris Agreement is hoping to limit temperature rise to, which is what people say is safe for humanity, that is likely to become 8 to 9 times more likely. With 2 degrees Celsius, that extremely hot day becomes 14 times more likely. And God forbid, if there were a 4 degrees Celsius kind of temperature scenario, then an extremely hot day will become 40 times more likely. So just imagine 4 hot countries where you have extremely hot days anyway occurring in a normal course of events, the frequency of these extreme events becomes such that it becomes very hard to recover, to get relief. Even nights become hot. So this is really the problem with climate change, that sometimes when we talk about things like 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, it seems like it's not very much, but the averages hide a lot of variation and a lot of extremes from place to place and from day to day. And so there are always more serious kind of fluctuations that are being hidden by the averages. Again, these charts are from this IPCC Bible, almost as it's called. It is basically hundreds of scientists from around the world who every few years review all the evidence that there is on climate change. And you can see for India how with 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, and 4 degrees Celsius, we see this warming that's happening from 1 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, right? But also think about specifically those very hot days that I mentioned. So this chart looks at how many days are above 35 degrees Celsius, right? So very hot days. And you can see for India, it's already brown, right? Even already we have many days, but as we get into a warmer and warmer climate, this number of extremely hot days goes on increasing. And this has direct effects on health, on crops, on even industrial production. So one of the major predictions from this IPCC report is that heat waves and humid heat stress in particular will increase in South Asia. This has a direct effect on health. Monsoon rainfall is predicted to increase, but there will be more variability from year to year. So it becomes more erratic. And the last time that you had on the planet these kinds of temperatures was more than 3 million years ago. So the basic message of the IPCC report is that these are serious changes that are happening that we've not had to adapt to. Now, let us set aside climate change and the climate change science. In India, we have many economic and social reasons because of which the same amount of climate change will hit us harder than, say, the developed countries. So this is a mapping that the Department of Science and Technology has done for states. And you can see all of these indicators that they've taken over here, they relate to agriculture, to health infrastructure, to poverty. And you can see what you get is basically like a development map of India, a baseline development map. And these are the states which are more vulnerable to any kind of risks, including climate change. But this picture is not just static. There are often many things, many actions that human beings take in order to protect themselves, which can actually end up increasing their exposure or vulnerability and make them actually maladaptive in nature. I'm in Bangalore, and today we saw that there was all these pictures and videos coming in of traffic to Electronic City. And there was flooding on the flyover, which is very hard to imagine. Usually we think about flooding in low-lying areas, but this was a flyover that was flooded. Now, obviously, this is because of bad construction or bad engineering. The highway to Mysore, again, another very important IT corridor because, Infosys is a major campus in Mysore. So the Bangalore-Mysore highway has been becoming 10-laned. But because they did not take into account the valleys that naturally existed and the previous canals that allowed water to flow, and 6-foot, 7-foot culverts were reduced to 1 foot, there was no space for the water to go when you had rainfall that was unusually high for this part of the world. For 100 millimeters plus rainfall in a day, it's very unusual for this part of Karnataka. This is not the rainy part of Karnataka. And so the entire newly built highway, newly built toll plaza have all got flooded. This example, this picture that you see over here is from Bihar, actually, from the Kosi River, which tends to change its course. It is a river that comes very rapidly down from the Himalayas, brings a lot of sediment, and has historically changed its course from time to time. And the agriculture of Bihar and the people who live over there historically used to adapt to the changing course of the river. I mean, they used to just take it for granted. They knew this would happen. But in modern times, what we've tried to do is to try to contain the river by building physical embankments and to restrict its course to a particular trajectory. And so what we find in certain flood years when, say, the rainfall is very high, is that these embankments prevent the water from flowing, from spilling. And so even if you have rigid embankments built over here, there is breach of these embankments downstream, and the flood spreads in another location. And plus what happens is once there has been flooding, the water can't enter back into the river because of the embankments. So you could have months of water stagnation outside of the embankments as well. And then people have to live in those conditions. So human actions to find engineering solutions to climatic stresses can also sometimes have to be, will need to be modified in order to be fit for purpose. Let's now look at what are the causes of climate change. I'll just speak very briefly. Mainly carbon dioxide is responsible for, you can see over here, this is how much temperature warming is because of how much of which gas. So you can see about 0.5 degrees Celsius of warming is because of methane. More than half, about 0.75 degrees, is because of carbon dioxide. And then you also have these blue ones, which actually lead to cooling, the kind of volcanic effect that you spoke about. So when you have pollution, sulfate aerosols, they actually cause cooling. So this is something to keep in mind. For the world as a whole, we know that right now about 50 billion tons of CO2 are being put in the atmosphere every year. And this is what is projected to continue happening, even with all of the actions on renewable energy and electric mobility and all that. The business as usual trend is that we'll continue to put that much. But actually, if you want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, then somewhere by the middle of the century, these emissions need to come down to almost zero. It will never be fully zero, but almost zero, which means that in just another 10 years or so, we have to halve the emissions for the world as a whole in order to reach 1.5. So this is obviously a very, very big challenge, but it just gives you a sense of how much momentum there is in the atmosphere. The amount of emissions that we have already put in the atmosphere worldwide. Just there was one study yesterday which said with just that much of emissions that is already in the atmosphere, that warming is likely to lead to melting of the Greenland ice sheet and to have about 1/4 meter of sea level rise. Whatever we do from now on, that much we are committed to. But we can make sure that it doesn't get worse. So these kinds of actions are important for that. About 89 countries covering 74% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so that's almost 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions, have committed to a net zero target. The countries which are in yellow, like the United States, have said that they will try to make their emissions net zero by 2050. The countries which are in, sorry, not United States, Canada, the countries which are in blue, like the United States, some countries in Europe, have tried to put a target here before 2050. And the countries that are in orange, like India, have said that they'll have a target here after 2050. But still, there is a kind of a long-term signal, a long-term sense that emissions have to come down. They can't go on increasing up. India has a target here of net zero for 2070. And can anybody tell me, so for example, we know roughly India's emissions right now in any given year are about 2 or 3 billion tons of CO2. Yeah. Does anybody know that by 2050, how much this is likely to increase? Do you think it will be the same? Do you think it will double? Or do you think it will increase 10 times or more? Any guesses?
Probably 10 times.
Probably 10 times. How many people feel that going the way we are going in terms of our energy use, by 2050, that is another 30 years, emissions will increase 10 times per year? How many people do? Is that what everybody feels? Or does anybody think it'll be the same? I'm sorry, I can't see you because my screen is on full screen. So I can't see you. I can't see the chat box. So I just ask you, just unmute yourself and just shout out the answer, whatever you feel. Same, double, or 10 times?
Hi, sir. I'm not sure whether how much they will increase, but I've read that the emissions will peak around 2045. So they will increase for sure. For sure, more than double, but I'm not sure of the exact figure.
Okay. Anyone else? I can't do an opinion poll. So anybody, how many people feel that it'll be double? Silence.
I think it will be more than double.
More than double?
Yeah.
So I
Okay.
think the same, that it will be more than double. Also, not just to say that it will double or it will be 10 times or more. So I think the India's development also, like economic development also, there is a thing called environmental Kuznets curve. So I think if we go by that thing, if India's economic development is in the path of just transition, then we can, but even then it will be more than double, I'm sure.
Okay. So you're all about right. So right now we're somewhere around 2 billion, 2.5 billion. And this is projected to increase to less than 6 billion. So not 10 times. It's a manageable amount, but this is not a scenario which is a do-nothing scenario. This has a lot of renewable energy, electric mobility. And, you know, when the person who spoke about development, our development is already becoming cleaner because we're using more clean energy and we are using energy more efficiently. So the same amount of GDP that's being produced, the same amount of the same per unit of industrial production, we're using energy more efficiently. So that's our GDP, the energy or GHG intensity of GDP. But even then you see the black line going up. So something more has to be done, something special has to be done, something different has to be done, because the reference scenario, even if it has a fair amount of clean energy policies in it, is not going to get us to our net zero 2070 target. So it requires a completely different economic pathway. And let's see where the emissions in India are coming from. And you find that the yellow one is electricity generation, the power sector. You see, it's not increasing in terms of emissions. The amount of electricity is increasing, but the emissions are not increasing because even in the business as usual scenario, there's a lot of renewable energy that is coming in, which doesn't lead to emissions. Transport, though it is quite small, is increasing. So it was very small over here and it's quite big. And industry is becoming very big. And by industry, we mean major industries like iron and steel and cement. So the green is cement, the blue is iron and steel, the yellow is chemicals. This is where a lot of the emissions are coming from, and not necessarily from use of energy in these industries. It's often coming from process emissions. Just the way that steel is manufactured, it releases certain chemicals into these certain emissions. And until we find a new way of making steel, we can't get rid of those emissions. So that's why you will find often references in the news these days to green hydrogen, that is hydrogen, which becomes a fuel that you use instead of fossil fuels. And it is hydrogen that is produced from renewable energy. So it's green hydrogen. So a lot of new kinds of process changes are happening in Indian industry already. On transport, a lot of times we talk about people using cars or people flying by air. But actually, if you look at this big black chart over here, the bulk of India's growing emissions are going to come from trucks, because as the economy grows, there's a lot of goods traffic, and we have stopped using railways for this kind of goods traffic, and we are sending this traffic by road. So bulk of the emissions are going to come from freight trucks, and it's very hard to find solutions to this, because with such big trucks, you can't easily have them running long distance on electric batteries. Yeah? You need large batteries, and you need to have them be able to run long distances. So while some of these two-wheelers, three-wheelers, cars are actually easier to electrify and then get that electricity from renewable energy, freight trucks are going to be a problem. But let me just take a few minutes more to say what are the positives. One of the positives is that the cost of renewable energy has fallen drastically in just 10 years by 85%. And these gray bands that you see over here, this is the price of coal-based or fossil-based electricity. And you can see whether it is PV, solar photovoltaic, or wind, it is becoming in the same price range as fossil fuels. So the prices have fallen drastically, and they are competitive with coal. And the other thing is that if you look at, there's this organization called the International Energy Agency, which every year presents an outlook, a kind of a prediction about renewable energy. And these are all these reports that have been there over many, many years. And the reality, which is this black line, is always outperforming the forecast. So the fall of prices of renewable energy and the addition of the renewable energy capacity, particularly on solar, has always outpaced the predictions of experts. So that is something that gives me a lot of optimism. If you remember that net zero graph that I showed for India, the black line going up and the green line coming down, to make that happen, you need changes in every sector: energy, buildings, transport, industry, land. But if you organize these mitigation options, these measures to reduce emissions, in order of their cost, like from the cheapest to the most expensive, you find a whole bunch of options which are listed over here, which are actually negative cost. By that, I mean that they end up saving more money for the industry or for the country than they cost. It's almost like it pays back for itself. So something like shifting from road to rail for those freight trucks, it will pay for itself because you'll need less petrol. You'll need to pay less for petrol for those road trucks. Same with any energy efficiency options, fuel economy. You're saving fuel, you're saving energy, and so you're saving money. So almost half of these options you can see are actually negative cost. The problem that happens is it takes time to recover the cost, but sometimes you need to make an investment upfront. You may need to invest in a new kind of technology or a new vehicle, right? But definitely this is something that there are many, many cost-effective options to be adopted. There are other kinds of benefits as well. As a result of the emissions, GHG emissions actions, things that you take for climate change, you also reduce other types of pollution. And this can save 80 lakh premature deaths from now to 2050 because of these reduced air pollutants and the cardiovascular and other respiratory diseases that happen as a result. Same with water. A lot of thermal power plants, coal power plants, use a lot of water for cooling. And if we switch to renewable energy, you can save 41 trillion liters of water between now and 2050, which is not insignificant for a country like ours. Now you can say that, even solar power, you need to wash or clean the panels, but increasingly there's robotic dry cleaning systems being installed. So there also there's a big saving. Another kind of benefit that we see through our modeling studies, and which a lot of people predict, is that there will be new jobs created. because there will be so much of new renewable energy construction, electric vehicle manufacturing, green hydrogen production that will happen, that almost 15 million new jobs per year could be created as we go forward after the 2030s, particularly when more and more of these investments take place. I'm happy to talk more about this because we have to make sure that people have the skills to access these new green jobs. Other co-benefits, I mean, we use the word co-benefits to say that, you know, something that is done from a climate change perspective has many, many other benefits for development. So here, this is a picture from a hospital, a small rural hospital in Jharkhand, where during the COVID pandemic, they were able to keep running their ventilators because they had put solar panels. Otherwise, they were having to use diesel, and their diesel bill was like 50 lakhs a month, which was very difficult for them to pay. So many different developmental benefits can come as a result of renewable energy. But there are risks also. So this is an example, this paper you can read, there's a link there, is that often there are connections between different environmental problems. And there's a study which shows that as a result of the air pollution that we have in North India, the output of solar plants in North India can fall by as much as 40%. So just imagine, it's almost like you're putting a kind of a layer of dust on a solar panel, because the sunlight that we're lucky enough to get, we're not able to fully convert it into electricity because of this layer of pollution that exists in between. So the solar panels are not getting the full amount of radiation because of pollution. So just think of it this way. You think of a solution, a technological solution to climate change, but because you have not addressed the problem of air pollution, another environmental problem, that technical solution to climate change is only half as effective. So this is why we need to look at different environmental problems or social problems together and not just, you know, separately. This is a picture from a town called Ramnagara, which is on the Bangalore-Mysore highway, and it is a hub of silk reeling of the silk industry. And it is small cottage industries like this. India has something like 600, I think 60 million micro enterprises. By micro enterprises, we mean those who have put in less than, you know, I think 1 crore of investment and less than 5 crores of annual turnover. They're often run by families or, you know, just very small kind of establishments. And they have a lot of scope for shifting to renewable energy. Here, for example, they have to be constantly using hot water, and you could use solar thermal for that hot water. But the problem is that because these units are so small and so pressed for time and money, that even if there are schemes to help such industries shift to cleaner energy, they don't have the capacity to go and access that money. So there is a lot of scope, a lot of potential for industrial energy efficiency, but we have to go beyond the targets that are taken by the big companies and make sure that they use their targets to actually reach out to their MSME supply chains and help them also to switch to new clean technologies. Does anybody know what this picture is? I mean, the answer is there on the slide, but usually we see this picture of night lights, but what is this?
These are the solar energy installation stations all over the world.
Exactly. So you can see a lot of solar energy in India. This is a website called resourcewatch.org. I'll encourage you to look at it. There's a lot of data, a lot of maps over there. But if you overlay this map of solar installations with what kind of land use there was before, right? I mean, these big solar farms, some of the biggest in Asia coming up in India, there was something being done on that land before the solar farm was set up. Do you want to guess what is the major use in India? Where are these solar farms coming up?
Was it farming?
Exactly. Yeah. Most of it is farming. And after that, the next is what are called grasslands. Often they're called arid lands. But there also there is pastoralism that happens, right? People use it for grazing. So one of the concerns that we have to keep in mind is that as we go forward, right now, the amount of solar power that we have, it's still like the beginning of the energy transition. But as we go forward and solar power has to increase 10 times or more, we need to find ways to make sure that it doesn't have impacts on food security or on the livelihoods of people who were doing traditionally farming. Now, this is not an easy kind of issue because for farmers, especially in dry land areas where rainfall is less, where monsoon is erratic, it may be that if they lease their land for the solar farm, that's actually more reliable income than having to deal with drought and having to do farming. But there's a lot of displacement that happens. People have to migrate to the cities. And particularly what happens is that the women are left behind. Women were often working as laborers. They were earning some wages as well. And even if there are jobs sometimes in the city or sometimes in the new jobs that are coming up on the solar park, women don't get easy access. They may not be able to move easily to join training programs. And this is something which is a particularly important issue. Does anybody know what is the women's workforce participation rate in India? That is, out of say 100 women, how many of a working age, how many are actually working? And all kinds of work, farm work, industrial work. Does anybody know in India on average? Just take a guess.
20, I think.
Yeah, that's very close. But do you also know that it is falling? It used to be closer to 30.
It's fallen, especially since the pandemic, if I'm not.
No, it was falling from 2005, and there are two reasons for this. One is a good reason, one is a bad reason. The good reason is that because the working age is defined as 15 to onwards, a lot of young women from 15 to 20 are actually staying in education. So they're not going into the workforce because they're staying educated, they're staying in school and college for longer. So that's a good reason. But the bad reason is that there is lack of access to training opportunities. There's lack of access to good, safe transport, housing, hostels, all of this. And so what happens is that even as a family's income improves, they may feel that the women of the family don't need to work, should not work. It's not safe. It's not decent, dignified jobs. So that's really going to be a big challenge in India's low carbon transition journey. It's not going to be so much what we do to reduce emissions, or but how we do it. Do we do it in a way that protects the livelihoods of the lowest income communities? I mean, the picture that I showed earlier from the solar farm, there were some areas, there were some gaps between the solar farms, and so you could graze your sheep over there. But this is not a very popular option. And here there are factories, electric mobility two-wheeler factories, which are employing a lot of women. About 20% of micro enterprises in India are owned by women. So we need to have special schemes for women-owned MSMEs in particular. So that's really a very important part of this whole journey. And finally, I'll just end with one last slide. You might have seen in the news a lot of emphasis from the Prime Minister, from the Government of India on behavioral change, on lifestyle change. And I just wanted to share a couple of statistics from the IPCC report. It's not for India specifically, but for the world as a whole, that the 10% richest households in the world, the 10% richest families, and by the way, that will include all of us, they are responsible for 36 to 45% of total greenhouse gas emissions. While half of the bottom income families, the bottom 50%, only account for 13 to 15%. So a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions, whether it is energy, transport, clothing, travel, all of that is coming from the richest households. And so providing energy access for basic development for the world's poorest, that's not going to affect emissions significantly. But if you can cut emissions by 40 to 70 of the world's wealthiest, then emissions can fall by 40 to 70% by 2050 compared to what would have been the reference scenario. So that's really the key to behavioral change, to lifestyle change, to see whether the actions or the consumption patterns of the richest in the world and the richest in our country as well, which again, I'll repeat that, it's all of us. If we can cut our emissions by half, then that will have a major impact. And I'll just end with one small example that especially, during the pandemic, all of us were leading very simple lives. And I was trying to do this carbon footprint calculator to see how much of my emissions. And it was all very simple. I don't travel. I mean, I don't buy too much stuff. I don't eat fancy things, etc., etc. So very nice. But one international trip for work and my carbon footprint went through the roof, right? While it was saying, initially, oh, 1 planet, 2 planet, put in the travel for work, not even for holidays. 8 planets is what my carbon footprint was. Yeah. So that's just us giving a sense of how difficult the challenge is and how everything we have to try to tackle this problem. But thank you so much for listening patiently. I've taken more time than I had thought. But Kaushik, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ulka. Wonderful presentation, I think, very eye-opening. But I think I'll open the floor for question and answers and comments and anything from the ambassadors here. Request anyone who has a question or a comment or anything that you want to ask, please unmute and you can ask. Ulka.
I'll go first. Thank you, Ulka, for sharing that. I think every time we watch such kind of stats and pictures, it's like, again, a blow on face. So my question is, you talked a lot about what's happening, especially in India. How are we recording, or let's say various organizations in India and that, for that matter, WRI, how are we recording the development part also? Like, how are we recording what's happening positive, right? We all talked about that we'll shoot 10x times, but we didn't actually keep in mind that there is positive stuff happening also, right? Development happening. How is that recorded? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Now, let me give you 2 answers. One is the very kind of geeky answer, which is actually it gets captured in one number, which is this GHG intensity of GDP. Because what it means is that we are increasing our economic output, but we are drastically decoupling it from emissions. So that's one number to capture the positive developments. And I think from 2005 to today, India's GHG intensity of GDP has fallen by 27%. And recently, India adopted a target of by 2030, that is in just 8 years, we will reduce it 45% compared to 2005. So that means it's almost like half the emissions will be generated for the same amount of GDP. So that's one way that these things are tracked. But I think the sort of the spirit in which you ask the question, I think there is a great need for documenting best practices, case studies, success stories, and sharing them in multiple regional languages. Something that Bihar is doing, for example, should be shared with Gujarat or with Maharashtra is doing, should be known in Uttar Pradesh so that people can learn from each other. And the same with companies as well. There's a lot happening. The risk, of course, is with this kind of thing, is the risk is kind of putting too glossy a picture in it, of greenwashing, that anything gets presented as a success story. And that's why, sorry to go back to it as an economist, the GHG intensity of GDP is a very precise number because it takes into account the fact that the total amount of emissions may still go on increasing because, so it's like a numerator versus denominator, and your total could still increase. So actually we have to be a bit careful and track both of these numbers, the total emissions and the GHG intensity of GDP. But certainly there needs to be much more awareness about positive developments.
I just wanted to ask a question. I know, you were sharing about the female labor participation rate and all of that. And at Climate Asia, actually, one of the projects our team is taking up is related to, gender, employment and livelihoods, and, how renewable energy and microgrids play a role. And we just wanted to, I guess, know, in case you have anything, based on your study, that you have found as something that should be looked at as a gap in terms of female labor participation, the just transition, and renewable energy.
Yeah, I think I'll put in the chat box a study that some of my colleagues had done a few years ago. And one of the points that they raise is this issue of training programs, that often the training programs for new green jobs are not easy for women to access. So that's something I think that that can be addressed directly, because otherwise what you may have is that there may be jobs created, there may be training programs being held, and you may think that there's a lot happening, but there's a gap that happens over there. Apart from that, I mean, I would say that, you know, look at the sectors where women are employed more, and look at the sectors where emissions are increasing more. So often, kind of an overlap of this is the construction sector, where you have a huge amount of emissions coming from cement production, steel production for cement, for construction. And you have a lot of women being employed as, you know, just wage labor, right? Those who you see on the streets who are lifting. And these are very poor working conditions in which they have to work. So I think one has to sometimes look at sectors beyond the ones that are being talked about, renewable energy, that is solar energy or electric mobility, and think about other sectors which are not very friendly to women anyway, but which employ a large amount of women. Another one I would say is the textile and garment industry, where climate change has not been a major concern. What has been a major concern has been water pollution, because, you know, when they use dyes or they use, you know, other chemicals and they just release the effluents into water bodies, there have been a lot of pollution related regulations because of that. But huge employer of women. Is there a way for these sectors to, you know, you use the word just transition, is there a way for these sectors to think about switching to cleaner technologies, being supported by providing them the, you know, access to schemes in order to subsidize the adoption of cleaner energy, but also work with workers' unions, or say, as I said, even MSMEs which are owned by women, small food enterprises, food processing things in villages. These are, I think, the three sectors I would highlight: construction, textiles, and maybe food processing in rural areas. Yeah. And I just want to add a line to about Ritika's question, you know, the question that I asked you, whether it'll double or 10 times and all that. I asked the same question in a pollution conference last week, that how much do you think air pollution will increase? And everybody said exponential, right? And these were all experts, air pollution experts. But actually the truth is the projection, so even that will be double or triple or double around, right? 1.5 to 2.5 times. So the picture is not as, you know, it's not exponential all that, but 2 or 3 is also difficult enough because we are on a growing trajectory, right? So, but it helps, you know, as Ritika said, to track these things, right? And to get a clear number about what are we talking about, what is the magnitude of measures that are needed. Otherwise, you feel very helpless. You feel that nothing you do will have any effect.
Yeah, Kaushik, I have a question. Yeah. So I have a lot of questions, but I just saw you are saying just one more. So I'll just throw some questions and you know, whatever you feel like you can just answer. So first is, how critical do you think the direct air capture and carbon capture technology would come in? And second, a lot of times I feel that all the policies and initiatives the Prime Minister launched live under Niti Aayog, all that looks like greenwashing. So do you like on a policy level greenwashing? And then the other question I have is, there's a lot of buzzwords coming up recently, like degrowth, decolonization, new monetary theories and all. And given the different pathways and scenarios we are seeing, it is very critical that we work on that. Do you think it would remain just buzzwords and philosophies, or would that transcend into something? And I had few more, but yeah, I'll leave you with these.
I'll try to give one-line answers to these. So the direct air capture and carbon capture and storage, very critical. The IPCC report shows that actually 1.5 degrees Celsius seems almost out of reach unless you have carbon capture and storage or even direct air capture. Now already gone beyond one line, but there's a lot of carbon capture and utilization that is possible. So for example, there was a plant in Tuticorin which captured CO2 from the power generation and used it to generate soda ash. So that is possible. Direct air capture is a more tricky kind of thing. Is behavioral change greenwashing, or is policy announcement greenwashing? Yes and no. I think a lot of times when big policies are announced, there is a change in the direction of policies. Right? There's a change in the narrative. There's a change in the discourse. I think it does serve to inspire and motivate change. On behavioral change, that's why I included those numbers in my last slide, which is actually you need to think about changing the consumption or moderating the growth in consumption with the richest people. Another way of thinking about it is if you just have technologies, but nobody uses those technologies, then they won't succeed. So my modeling can show you what technologies are needed, but unless people actually travel in public transport or they buy a kind of sustainable fashion or something like that, it won't actually change. One example of a combination of this is in the United States, they recently made an announcement that any government housing or any government buildings will be constructed only using low carbon steel or low carbon cement. So if you're a company, you can't bid for that tender unless you're manufacturing low carbon steel or cement. So you need a combination of a technology. If you don't have that process to make low carbon steel or low, then there's no point. Second, you need a policy where the government mandates something. And third, you need a behavioral change aspect where architects, designers, consumers start saying, I'm looking for green materials for my house. So together, then it won't be greenwashing. The green growth, degrowth, I'll skip actually. I'm not an expert on that, sorry.
Thank you everyone for the questions, and thanks Ulka for the presentation and spending time answering all these questions. I think we will have to end this session, the first segment here. Thank you so much from the Climate Asia side for being here and spending time with us. And I think there are more questions coming in the chat box, which I'm sure we will collect. And
I'll stay on and answer some of the questions in the chat box. Right. Thank you.
Let's see if we have time in the last.
I'll just type the answers, no worries. So.
Thank you. All right, so let's get into the next segment. So we have Shreeshan from Climate Trends, and the next topic is on how the climate concerns are becoming threat multiplier across policy making in India. So let me introduce our speaker quickly, and then Shreeshan, welcome. And Shreeshan Venkatesh is working as senior analyst at Climate Trends, and he's an environment and science journalist with close to a decade of reporting experience on intersections of technology, development, environment, and society. Before joining Carbon Copy, Shreeshan was a senior correspondent at Down to Earth magazine, where he worked extensively on climate science policy and other implications on society. He has also contributed to Climate Change Now, a book that analyzes science, politics, and economics of 25 years of climate change negotiations. I now welcome Shreeshan to take the floor. Welcome, Shreeshan.
Thank you, and good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here, to speak to all of you, to interact with a group with such diverse backgrounds and different levels of familiarity with climate. I think Ulka did a great job setting the context and bringing out where we stand in terms of our ability to respond to climate change, the impacts that we are facing, and how those carry ramifications across society and different levels of economy. So it's going to be a really tall order to follow that, but I'll try my best. What I plan to do is I have a very short, brief deck. Given the different levels of comfort with the subject, I decided to keep it fairly broad. I took the liberty to change the topic just a little bit. I'm going to start sharing my screen. That's better. So rather than talking about climate change and climate concerns as a risk multiplier or a threat multiplier, I thought it might be more useful to talk about it as a disruptor of the policy space. Generally, that's true across the world, and it's also true in India. And to go through that, I thought it might be useful for each of your work and each of your areas of interest to just kind of identify why climate is important for policy making, why it makes a difference, how the problem of climate change has been digested so that it can be incorporated into policy, and what the trends are currently, what the priorities are currently in shaping these policies. And I'm not going too much into any specifics, and if there are, I encourage you to ask them if you have any questions that are specific to a certain sector or a certain theme, a certain area. I encourage you to ask me, and if I can, I will answer them. So the first thing that when I was trying to think about how to go about the session and fit in as much information as possible, or as much useful information as possible in a concise form, the first question that came to mind is, most of us now, it's been like over a generation that climate change has been in the public conscience, in the public consciousness, and all of us have our own understanding of climate change. Some of us look at impact, some of us look at it from a futuristic perspective. Some of us look at it in terms of politics, historic responsibility. There is not a very clear one-line definition of everything that it involves. So you might have heard of climate change being described as like a civilizational challenge or a civilizational threat. While it's a simplistic way of putting it, it's not entirely untrue, because what climate change essentially is an externality. How human systems of governance have evolved over our history has been tending towards settling for systems that ensure maximum amounts of security and reliability while minimizing uncertainty. Any system of governance that is not able to provide these basics is under the threat of being replaced or under the threat of collapsing. And that's pretty much why climate change is a critical point of discussion or deliberation within policy circles, and how exactly to enforce the intent of climate action on the ground, and how to bring about change through that. So I would encourage everyone to think of climate change as this disruption, as this externality that is forcing changes onto human governance systems, human systems of economy, of society, of all things, to think about how to minimize damage of these new externalities, these new exposures, and to minimize the scale and likelihood of future adversity, future damage. These two areas of necessity has kind of developed into the two prongs, which are, I'm sure most of you must be aware, adaptation and mitigation. Just to go over very briefly, even within adaptation, it's essentially a response to the vulnerabilities of human society to any kind of impending or existing impacts that are occurring due to climate change. Now, I've listed three of them. One is rapid onset events, extreme weather, increase in frequencies that are being felt, increase in intensity that is being felt at any moment, and can be attributed in part, mostly in part, to changes in climate over recent years. The second is slow onset events. These are pretty much changes that are happening over a long period of time, progressively and incrementally, that reach a tipping point when they start having adverse effects on societies that are or governance structures that are dependent on those changes, or those ecosystems, those systems that are facing primary changes. The third one is an example of that would be like sea level rise or deglaciation, changes in water basins, and so on, and how they have to be reflected in how you plan for the utilization of those resources, and how reliable those resources will be moving forward. The third one is progressive impacts. They are basically changes that are being felt incrementally. They both add up as well as hold value, are open up vulnerabilities even in the moment. So these are changes like drop in productivity, labor productivity, drop in yields, nutritional values dropping, and so on. That incrementally will change as the parameters of this environment change with climate. The understanding of, there's a fourth one that is that's more or less it's called low probability high impact events. I didn't include it because just by definition they are low probability, and so they have a much lower level of reflection or degree of reflection in policy. So I just left that out for now. Those mainly include like massive planetary system collapses, carry huge risks, and very limited prospects of being able to adapt or adjust or to those changes, and also by definition carry a lot of damage with them. The strategies that have kind of evolved from this recognition of these different kinds of changes have all kind of coalesced over a few principles of increasing preparedness. So you use technology, you use policy levers, you use money, economics, you use society or social pressures, all of these things to increase or reduce the vulnerability according to the very specific impacts that a society or governance system faces. And I've just mentioned three of them over here that are typically seen as risk reduction strategies within which specific interventions are kind of fit in. So there is preparedness, how well you are aware of any kind of event that is coming up, any change that is likely to be felt in the foreseeable future, and how well you are able to prepare yourself to face those changes. Resilience is more systemic, building that the same kind of or reducing the vulnerability through systemic interventions that would be able to respond to these impacts in a better way. And the third one is behavioral change. The changing of say cropping patterns, varieties, choices, moving from one place to another, changing of your employment, your primary employments, and so on. That societies and humans kind of take to be able to adapt better, which gives them a better chance of reducing that vulnerability that they face. The second wide prong is basically mitigation. Again, I'm sure most of you must be aware that this is more or less aimed at reducing the future vulnerability, reducing the chances of lock-ins or the degree with which our systems, our economies are locked into climate change or locked in with climate change impacts. And this, to a certain extent, mitigation is, it's a much more economic kind of question. The idea of mitigation primarily comes from the conventional understanding that economies are a reflection of the carbon they consume. So with the Industrial Revolution and all the changes, the monumental shifts that it brought, generally a society's or a country's any unit's GDP or economic value could be linked directly to how much energy they're consuming to produce all the different things that would be used. And over the years, especially in recent years, this has become more complex, particularly with the kinds of technological innovations that Ulka was mentioning, that you don't need to consume the same amount of carbon or emit the same amount to be able to achieve similar units of GDP, particularly with the expansion of the service sector, the growth of the digital economy, the way in which carbon and units of economy are kind of linked has been changed, and they're more or less segmented according to the area of the economy or the sector of the economy that you look at. Within mitigation, ultimately the aim is to minimize the risk of future climate change impacts. So the aim is to reduce the amount of carbon without bringing down economic prospects. So a lot of change, a lot of growth improvements have happened technologically. Typically, there are these 4 strategies that are being used to different extents, and different levels of importance are being given to these. So the first one is emission intensity of the GDP. This is more systemic. It's a larger scope of assessment, and it essentially reducing emission intensity of your GDP would require you to move towards greater value per unit of carbon kind of activities. So service sector is one example. The blooming of the renewable energy sector within the energy sector of the renewable energy landscape is another example. So you would try to bring down how much carbon is emitted from your entire economic activity. The second one is emission efficiency, where you're trying to produce or provide the same good service, but reduce the amount of amount of emissions associated with that production, with that activity that you're doing. So that is, a lot of it has been driven by technological advancement, a shift in energy sources, just reducing the wastages and redundancies that existed in the past has all led to this, and it also forms a big part of our NDC right now, as it did in the first iteration of the NDC in 2015. The third one is removal and utilization. Again, something that Ulka had mentioned. So this, like she mentioned, there are many pathways of doing this. It's now pretty much certain that there is going to be some overshoot, and there will be some requirement to remove carbon from the atmosphere as well as from point sources, if we are to have any chance of reaching, the Paris Agreement goals. And the fourth one is demand reduction. This is slightly trickier, and because it typically involves some kind of reduction in the economic value that your that your country or your region of governance holds, and you wouldn't like for demand to reduce, but would rather prefer it to be met with more efficient means. With that, I would like to just move into how these have started to become, or how these priorities, these strategies have been sought to be incorporated in policy. And I'll start with like the international policy landscape around this. That has been the driver. Climate change is something that is primarily seen as something that requires a collaborative, collective action response. So there have been, typically policy kind of lags in this space. Typically policy kind of lags science or new information by 10 to 20 years. Let's just say 15 years, and that has kind of given us eras that we have moved through, and also gives us a pretty decent understanding of where we are likely to be headed, how this space is likely to evolve. So the first, notable mentions of climate change, of global warming, of the potentials or of the implications of increasing carbon concentrations in the atmosphere started coming up in the 1970s. It took some time to gain acceptability, to gain some kind of traction. for there to be that moment of realization that happened in the early 90s, and through the next few years, the first concrete pieces of or international intent came about. Conventions were formed, and the first pieces of guiding policy kind of came up. It has taken since then to kind of 2015 was the marking moment of the Paris Agreement being signed, and it has taken that much time for us to move from the era of that realization to the era of action, where that action is no longer seen as a choice. So the choices are within that arena of action, but whether climate action is required or not is no longer really seen as a choice. And that era of action has also kind of translated or conveyed itself in a different way when we talk about this specific geography, when we talk about India. For India, climate policy or policies relating to climate change is the strategy is more or less a balancing act. India comes into this discussion, this deliberation, with a bunch of developmental priorities that already exist: increasing housing, increasing access to energy, food security, water security, and so on. There are several. So over here, in the conventional sense, there has always been that understanding that moving towards or setting yourself up for emission reductions in some way is a trade-off with developmental priorities. And that understanding has changed primarily due to a lot of the interventions and technological advancements that Ulka had mentioned earlier. So, right, the other side of this balancing act is also the fact that for India, a lot of the emissions, India has not peaked, so a lot of the emissions that India should rightfully have are yet to be developed or yet to come up. So there is an opportunity here to, rather than build something one way and then transition into another, to build something in a better way from the get-go. So these priorities have, or these understanding, these realizations have become more and more apparent in India's own evolution of India's own policy priorities and policy interventions. So when we look at climate change or the first kind of synergies with climate and policy in India, the focus was primarily on environmental protection, on conservation, and gradually with the changing international landscape, this has also moved towards incorporating economic, energy, developmental priorities, developmental criteria to kind of build those interconnections and those synergies. The first forays for this kind of policy making came in around 2008 with the National Action Plan for Climate Change. That there were 8 missions that were defined. Some of them were thematic in the environmental sense. Some of them were sectoral in the more economic sense, and it was very clearly a draft to kind of figuring out how climate change needs to be incorporated within policy. It's been 14 years since that. Some of the missions carry on. Some of them have kind of withered away, have been replaced by others. There have been a lot of changes in how climate change is incorporated into policy since then. The Paris Agreement brought forth a more consolidated approach of climate change policy as a part of economic strategy and planning. And the NDCs are very much a reflection of this, and the changes between the NDCs from 2015 and right now, from whatever we know, kind of also reflect this movement from looking at climate change as an environmental issue to a more of an economic issue that involves a lot of changes that have to be made in industry, that have to be made in behavior, that have to be made in planning, in strategy building, and so on. The way I just put down these 4 kind of priorities. Now the just moving back actually for a minute. This transformation from looking at climate change as an environmental issue to more of an economic issue has also forced the government into making choices, into weighing those benefits, the number of co-benefits, the number of synergies with other objectives that exist, how much of a how much feasibility technologically and financially exists for something, all of these things, and finally they're forced to make a choice to prioritize certain areas, certain kinds of policy interventions over others that they would see as either more harder to reach or more difficult to kind of achieve for a variety of reasons. And these 4 are basically the kind of criteria, overlaps, interconnections that the government has typically looked for in trying to devise their policy levers and their interventions, including schemes, rules, guidelines, what they choose to promote, what they choose to include to speak, what they choose to speak about, what they choose not to speak about, and so on. So the first one, as I mentioned, is developmental synergies. A good example is probably the LED light scheme. There was a need to improve energy efficiency of lighting. It could address multiple challenges, multiple roadblocks at the same time. So it was something that got the full weight of the government behind it. Similarly, the LPG cooking gas scheme, Ujjwala, is something similar. The second, and there are several examples of this. The Kusum scheme for solar pumps, again, is an example of that. The second one is the overlap, the interconnections with existing and new economic opportunities that are likely to come up, as well as looking at the technological, financial feasibility of different measures, of different ways of reducing your emission intensity of your economy. And this has pretty much the easy to address kind of areas so far with this have been in power and in transport, through renewable energy, through non-fossil fuel energy, and through electric vehicles, and setting up or trying to expand the EV ecosystem. There are, of course, other ways, other levers as well of achieving that drop in emission intensity that might be better in a more distributed benefit sense. An increase in public transport infrastructure, for example, is one such thing. The third one is security. And I don't just mean like physical or militaristic security, although that is a small part of it. More in terms of security of your resources, energy security, the reduction of dependence on external factors, external volatilities. And this is an area that the government has really been quite active in trying to expand through different measures on circularity, through different policies that are targeting areas that are further down or further up in the value chain, targeting manufacturing opportunities that exist, holding ambitions that are more outward facing, global, and recognizing that is an area that is going to be of value as and when the new energy economy starts becoming, or when the new energy economy becomes, well, just the energy economy. Then finally, there's public pressure. This is more political in nature. There are, it can also be legal. We have been seeing, not so much in India, because India's legal framework addresses or looks at climate change in a certain way that doesn't exactly fit into climate change litigation. But around the world, this has been, the increase in litigation has been a trend that is quite easily observable. Other than that, there's also public pressure that comes through, just civil society's expression of priorities or discontent, or making something a political issue. An example is the RA forest. There have been so many examples of governments being forced into certain policies, or rolling back certain policies because of public pressure that exists. And as the impacts of climate increase, there is a good chance that public pressure will start to coalesce around such language as well. Lastly, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of an idea of what is likely next, or what are the trends that are likely to continue in this, in the design of policy intervention, in the design of these tools, of these policy tools. Firstly, there's like an increase of significance of climate action in domestic policy. We are going to see that more and more as we move beyond power and transport as well. The first signs of that are already emerging, with the new energy conservation amendment that's been tabled, or that's in the process of being passed. That brings in sectors beyond power and transport into the energy efficiency, emission efficiency debate. There's also going to be a continued commodification of carbon, as trading schemes, trading platforms, as economic value starts getting defined in terms of how much you emit, or how much an entity emits, for the value that it creates. So that commodification of carbon is definitely something that is going to continue. Decarbonization is going to become a strategic lever, particularly when it comes to diplomatic, cross-boundary geopolitical negotiations that happen over trade, security, economics, however you want to see it. There is also going to be an increase in how policy objectives trickle down to local levels of governance, to subnational levels of governance, and how subnational systems of governance try to translate the objectives that come from the top to their own specific geographies. Finally, that also kind of points towards decentralization of this action. Here, there is likely going to be a greater decentralization of responsibility as well. So a dispersal of how action happens through a change in design of public infrastructure, of planning, to trying to disperse, the load of reducing emissions, or of responding to climate change throughout society and throughout different areas. So that's my time. I'm sorry for going over a little bit, and I hope that was helpful.
Thank you for the presentation, and I request any questions, if any of the participants have, to post it in the chat box, or you can unmute and speak.
So, like Ulka ma'am discussed about textile industry, and a few months back, I think European Union rolled out a policy on fast fashion and textile industry. Do you think implementation of that sort of policy in Indian ecosystem would be good for economic development as well as mitigating climate change?
So in India, there are already some companies that have taken up this voluntary action to make themselves more sustainable, or get that sustainable tag. The nature of the textile industry in India, this is one of those kind of balancing acts that the government has to pull off every time when they're thinking of policy interventions. So the nature of the textile industry in India is typically different from how it is in Europe. There is a lot of small money and a lot of small what they used to call cottage industry, or what Ulka referred to as micro enterprises that exists in the space. Often with this new energy economy that's coming up, one of the questions that is popping up repeatedly is who are going to be the new winners and new losers in this negotiation. It's not going to be painless. So one of the priorities is to not saddle those that are least equipped to undergo that pain, to not saddle them with those kinds of requirements. So hence, I wouldn't say that something that is whether it's with fashion or whether it's with any other sector, something that is successful or has been implemented well, has resulted in good results elsewhere, would be equally applicable in India. Having said that, the textile industry is something that the government has also looked at through a resource efficiency lens. So they have been thinking about bringing in more circularity in the supply chains or in the value chains that come from fashion, from textile, or are related to those areas. And even the way in which certain industries are being looked at is through more of a sustainability lens rather than a purely climate lens. And I would suspect that if ever there is this kind of a group of policies or a policy framework that is created for the textile industry, it would be more on the sustainability side of things to bring about greater resource efficiency.
Shreeshan, so when I look at adaptation or resilience, I look at from a very local, very contextual point of view. But the structure, the governance structure which we have in our country is very centralized. So a lot of planning doesn't come from grassroots, it trickles down. So I just want to know about your views on how this system is a barrier or supports the whole resilience and adaptation. And also, if you have some good examples of how resilience adaptation has been done in the local context in India, that would be helpful.
So I would agree and disagree both. It's not true that adaptation strategies have come from the top. It's not entirely true. Particularly when it comes to agriculture, we have a system that predates any climate change discussion, which is the KVK, the Krishi Vigyan Kendra, and they are the primary. And there is one in every district. They are the primary nodal agency for resilience building and adaptation for that district when it comes to agriculture. Agriculture is the most readily available example of this because of how it is distributed around the country and its relevance to the rural economy. So that is one. The other areas are, there is this whole area of study called DRR, disaster risk reduction, and that over past 10 years, 15 years, in fact, actually even more, since the big cyclones in Orissa in '98, there has been a realization that local bodies, particularly urban local bodies or local governance structures, are best suited to figure out what is the way to minimize damage from any of these climate impacts as well. So heat wave action plans for different cities is an example of this. the cyclone, cyclone preparedness plan for Orissa is an example. Similarly, there have been such examples that have happened in West Bengal as well. So there are these examples that exist. But largely what you are saying is true. The direction for any kind of intervention typically comes from, particularly when it's like economy wide or when it's industrial or sectoral, it comes from a more centralized fashion. It's first articulated at the national level and then gets translated at the local levels. So now we have states that have, I believe several of them have already prepared. I think 17 of them have already prepared the state action plans. You will see that for many of these areas, states will follow what the center kind of puts out as a direction of movement. And they are largely responsible for setting the agenda. And then states are expected to pick up that agenda and to translate it to their local environments. So this has also happened. We can talk about the state action plans later, I guess. It's a whole discussion in itself. There are several hits and several misses. So yeah, that's pretty much how, but definitely moving forward, necessarily this is going to agendas and priorities that are articulated at the national level will be translated more and more at local levels, particularly with the maturity of reporting requirements, of creating emission inventories. All of these things, as they become more and more mature, it will be required for local levels of governance to take up a bigger chunk of the responsibility. There are a couple of questions in the chat as well. Should I first take those and then maybe come back to the group?
Yes, Shreeshan, you can do that.
So the first one is from Jay Shah. I suppose everyone can read it. He's asking about, clear climate-oriented policies available in India. Are there any things that are purely based for sustainability and climate action? If not, is it a good idea to develop the same or not? So basically, one thing that I missed in my presentation was the first iteration, the National Action Plan on Climate Change, was attempted to be this, that it attempted to be a clear climate-oriented policy. But trying to tackle something so broad within a single piece of a single document is extremely difficult. So it lacked a lot of too many clear definitions. It mainly just stuck to intent and what they hope is going to come out of that policy, and left the smaller bits to be discussed in Parliament, to be taken as executive actions, to be figured out, in a more political space. And that has kind of evolved in a way where, in India at least, there is no one clear that this is the climate policy of India. I guess the only clear articulation like that is the NDC, which is submitted to the UNFCCC, which states the 3 short to medium term objectives or commitments that India will take up as their contribution towards that larger collective action. But within India, the way climate policy has evolved is in a very piecemeal fashion. So it's very difficult also to chart out how much money has been spent, what are the gains, what are the changes that have actually happened, because it has been in such piecemeal fashion, and that continues to be the case. So it continues to be very sectorally defined, very process oriented, but it is improving in the sense that now decarbonization and climate action is becoming more and more a feature of, it's not an exception anymore. Things have moved out of the MOEF and are basically a part of many different ministries, and the policies and the interventions that many different ministries are thinking about, are working on. So I'm not sure if it is a good idea or not, but it is definitely a good idea, and it is something that is ideal, that these different piecemeal policy measures are are linked, go hand in hand, are not, incoherent, where planning for one keeps a certain developmental, planning for one sort of energy keeps a certain developmental objective in mind, whereas another ministry is looking at a different kind of developmental objective, and there are clashes. That is something that has happened a lot in the past, that they're not very well coordinated in their interventions. But hopefully there will be better coordination as we move forward. It certainly seems like, at least in the incorporation of decarbonization and climate action, there has been some movement.
Thank you, Shreeshan.
Okay, that's pretty much, there's also this citizens can take initiatives for climate actions. They absolutely can. I like India is a democratic country. Political action is allowed, and citizens are definitely allowed to choose their own priorities and put pressure on governments. How governments respond is a different question altogether. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Shreeshan. My job is to conclude the session now. So thank you so much for your time and contributing to the discussion and answering all the questions. And I hope the whole couple of master classes that we had today was useful to all the ambassadors. Thank you, the team from Climate Trends and Ulka for being here from WRA. And we hope to see more such master classes happening for the ambassadors, and we will continue these conversations and discussions. If there are any thoughts and questions that may arise later, please feel free to reach out to us and we will relay the questions to the speakers and get back with responses. Thank you so much, everyone.